Working in a nonprofit is definitely not for the faint of heart, and leading a nonprofit, even more difficult. But working in nonprofits as a paid staff member can be one of the most incredibly fulfilling roles out there. So in this lesson, we're gonna talk about everything nonprofit staff. From hiring and training and retaining to applying theories of motivation, we'll discuss that important aspect of the nonprofit paid staff position. First, let me share how this ties into the bigger picture. We've now completed part one, which is the basics of nonprofits. In this section, part two, we're going to move on to the staff and all of the things that nonprofit leaders need to know when it comes to leading paid staff. In this chapter, we're going to start with managing and motivating nonprofit staff. Then in the next lesson, we'll talk about organizational structure and design, and then we'll conclude this part with a section and discussion on leadership and decision-making. By the end of this lesson, you'll be able to describe the labor force of nonprofits, including not just the paid staff, but also volunteers. You'll understand the different types of roles in nonprofit staff positions and categories of these jobs. You'll be able to identify the key factors in managing nonprofit staff, things like hiring, training, retaining, and part of retention is understanding turnover. You'll be able to distinguish between the different performance evaluation methods, and you'll be able to apply various theories of motivation to nonprofit staff. First, let's talk about the labor force of nonprofits, because this is a commonly misunderstood topic in nonprofits, because a lot of people assume that nonprofits are just comprised of volunteer unpaid labor. That's actually not true, but you already know that from part one. For most nonprofit organizations, they're run by a combination of people. They have a governance board, they have executive leadership, and they have staff members. The board is responsible for making overarching strategic decisions and doing things like setting policy and determining that overall direction. So in the last section, we talked about strategic planning and the important role that it plays. And the board is responsible for that function and that overarching direction. Now, we'll spend an entire future section talking about boards, but for now, just understand the role they play when it comes to nonprofit staffing. And remember, nonprofit boards are unpaid positions. These are volunteer leaders from the community that are brought on, sometimes elected, sometimes not. We'll talk about that in the board lesson. But they're responsible for that strategic direction. Now, what do I mean when I say executive leadership? Executive leadership in nonprofits often include the executive director or CEO position. Now, this can vary from nonprofit organization to organization. In a prior section, we talked about affiliate organizations. So affiliate organizations have a larger international or national umbrella office, and they may have a CEO of the overarching organization. Then you have chapters, branches, or affiliates, which are usually going to be headed up by what is called an executive director. Now, for smaller or mid-sized nonprofits or those that don't operate on an affiliate model, they can use these terms interchangeably. So sometimes you'll hear it referred to as executive director, sometimes CEO. Generally, that means your higher level leadership, your executive leadership. Now, in a lot of for-profit companies, that executive leadership isn't as involved in day-to-day operations. They have usually larger staffs, they have more layers of management, but nonprofits don't have that luxury. So executive leaders in nonprofits are generally charged with handling day-to-day operational tasks. And that includes things like implementing the board's decisions, working in tandem with the board to lead that strategic direction, and managing the organization's programs and activities. And depending on the size of the nonprofit, sometimes you'll find executive director or CEO executive positions really doing that day-to-day tactical stuff as well, down to the granular level. Now, for bigger nonprofits or mid-sized nonprofits, you'll generally have executive leadership, but you'll also have a paid staff. And the staff members carry out that organizational mission under the guidance of both the board and executive leadership. And leadership in nonprofits can get a little tricky because you have this volunteer staff partnership. We'll cover that in a future lesson, but know that when it comes to staff roles, they're generally working under the guidance of both their executive leadership and the board. Now, as I mentioned, there's a commonly held misconception about nonprofits that they do not have paid staff. That is not true. Many nonprofits rely on both paid staff and volunteers. And if you actually look at organizations in the nonprofit sector that have paid staff, it might surprise you that they actually have a higher proportion of paid staff to volunteers. That ratio sits at around 70-30. So about 70% of the workforce is paid staff, about 30% are unpaid volunteers. When it comes to nonprofit pay, another misconception about working in nonprofits is that it's going to destine you for a life of poverty. This really isn't true, and it frustrates me because it dissuades a lot of college students from pursuing nonprofit work as a career. I've done a lot of analysis in looking at the research of nonprofit pay, and there is unfortunately a lot of mixed results. So there's no one definitive answer about the differential between nonprofit pay and for-profit pay. There is a little bit of a difference where nonprofit employees make a little bit less than similar positions in the for-profit sector, but that distinction is not as big as a lot of people assume. So if you're considering nonprofit work as a career, please put it out of your mind that it's poverty wages. That's not always true. Now, there are other issues like potential burnout, work-life balance, heavy expectations, and again, marginally lesser pay, but it is a really great career path. Now let's talk about size of staff because you're going to see a ton of variability with this. Large nonprofits, on average, have about 389 employees, so that's pretty big. In comparison, small nonprofits average just under 5. So those are really small organizations where there's a lot of expectations and variety of responsibility put on a small staff team. While some nonprofits rely on part-time or contract labor, most paid staff positions in nonprofits overall, around 79%, are classified as full-time positions. So now that you understand about nonprofit paid staff positions, let's talk a little bit more specifically about the role, function, and key factor that a nonprofit executive director serves. Now, admittedly, I'm a little biased here because I served as executive director for over a decade, but I've also served in other non-ED roles in nonprofits. But of all positions in a nonprofit, most people would tend to agree that the role of executive director is the most influential. They play that key role in leading the organization. They're generally responsible for hiring the staff team and recruiting volunteers many times, as well as motivating the workforce of both paid and unpaid staff and volunteer labor. And they're also responsible for retaining the paid employees. And as I mentioned previously, on top of that, executive directors have a very difficult job because oftentimes they're asked to do day-to-day operational things as well. As I mentioned previously too, some nonprofit organizations don't have an executive director. Instead, they have a CEO. So some organizations kind of look at this as an interchangeable term of title. But for a lot of nonprofits, they use the term executive director. But regardless of the terminology, I'm referring to the highest ranking staff position that's executive leadership in a nonprofit. Now, an executive director has a boss. They're overseen by the board of directors. This is similar to how for-profit companies work. And it's the executive director's responsibility to make those staffing decisions, to do strategic planning. Really difficult job. It requires balancing multiple responsibilities and fulfilling various roles. To demonstrate the difficulty of the executive director position, I put together this graphic to show you the many roles of a nonprofit executive director in most, but not all, organizations. In addition to leadership responsibility, nonprofit executive directors are generally responsible for fundraising directly. And oftentimes this involves managing a portfolio of donors, of those higher level donors. On top of that, they're responsible in many cases for leading efforts to fulfill the mission through advocacy and program delivery. They often are responsible for being the face of the organization from a communications and public relations standpoint. They're responsible for board development. While they work in partnership with the board to lead the organization, the board does oversee technically that executive director position in most cases, but not all, but we'll talk about that. But nonprofit executive directors are generally responsible for the board as well. The executive director is also responsible for human resource functions. Of course, that includes hiring, firing, training, leading, and motivating, but sometimes it even includes the HR paperwork and the entire recruitment process from start to finish. And finally, while most organizations, the CEO position isn't involved in kind of day-to-day operational tactical things, executive directors and nonprofits generally are responsible for doing this as well. So if you take on the position of an ED, which is usually how we abbreviate executive director, you are expected to do a lot. Now that we've talked specifically about that executive director role, I want to look at other staff positions in nonprofit organizations and categorize them. The size of a paid staff of a nonprofit can be wildly variable. You can have a nonprofit of one that's just an executive director or founder of a nonprofit. As discussed, small nonprofits only have about 5 staff members, while large nonprofits have on average around 400 paid staff positions. So you're going to find a huge variance in staff positions, both in size of the paid staff workforce, as well as the job functions. And of course, the bigger the staff, the more specialized those staff positions can get. So generally speaking, I put together a graphic that will show you the 4 primary categories of nonprofit staff positions. And it's important to note that these categories, they are not mutually exclusive. And what that means is you aren't often just a management position. You're doing management plus something else. So there is some overlap here. So when you're looking at a nonprofit staff position and you're trying to categorize it into one of these 4 buckets, understand that nothing is going to perfectly cleanly fit into any one bucket because there generally is that overlap that exists. First, let's talk about management positions. Employees in a management role often carry the word director or manager in their title. So obviously this is going to include positions like that key leadership position, the executive director or the CEO. It also can include other layers of management as well. Usually your key fundraising person will have a title like development manager or development director. The person in charge of advocacy might be a director of government relations or an advocacy manager, so on and so forth. Now, what makes these positions management, obviously, is that they typically require management responsibilities. This includes oversight of other employees, and they generally carry a higher level of responsibility. But these are important roles for nonprofits to retain staff because staff have to feel like they have a career path and trajectory where they can climb up the ladder, so to speak. And if you don't have management roles, nonprofit employees are going to start to feel stuck in their roles and that there's no opportunity for growth. Next are administrative positions. And these are positions that generally do not directly do development work or program delivery, but rather they exist to support these functions. Now, in a nonprofit, obviously, the key functions that we do are fundraising, which is development work, and program delivery, actually going out and doing programs and services and events that fulfill the organizational mission. Now, doing these things requires a lot of administrative support. So administrative roles help support these 2 functions. And these administrative roles can be things like human resources, marketing, accounting, legal, volunteer engagement, or things like that. So these are still very important roles in a nonprofit, but they generally tend to support program delivery and fundraising or development work. But not all nonprofits have the luxury of having administrative support positions like these. In many cases, for those smaller nonprofits, if you are a development director, you may be the only person on the entire staff that does development. So you don't have someone helping you do donor proposals or send out tax letters or handle even the financial and accounting part of the job. You have to do it all. So the amount of administrative roles is going to vary depending upon the size of the nonprofit organization and how many paid staff positions it has. And I also want to make a note too that just because we're saying administrative here, this doesn't mean that these are low level or what would traditionally be seen as secretarial roles. Now, that is one of a type of administrative position in nonprofits. And larger nonprofits that have larger resources and more staff, they may have actual admin support to do more of those administrative tasks. But some of these are even still higher level, like marketing or human resources. Development positions are those that are responsible for fundraising. Now, obviously, fundraising is a central job task in every nonprofit because we have to bring in money to exist. So we're selling our product, which is mission. And instead of buying that product, people are donating in support of that product. So development is a key function in every nonprofit organization. And this can include not just direct fundraising with donors, but there's also things like grant writing, managing funding from foundations, or managing corporate support. Job titles in this category can have the word development in the title, but that's not necessarily always the case. Just some examples of development roles are development coordinator or development director. This is someone that does development and management, but primarily they're a development role. Grant writer, major gifts officer, planned giving coordinator, and lots of other examples. Program delivery positions are those jobs that directly provide and deliver programs, events, and services to the beneficiaries of the organization. This can include roles like social worker, childcare worker, policy analyst, program officer, outreach director, what have you. So these are positions that may or may not tangentially be related to fundraising, but they're primarily focused on delivering programs in support of the mission. And as a quick reminder, these 4 categories of nonprofit positions, they're not mutually exclusive. And the smaller the nonprofit, the more likely chance that you're going to see that overlap. If you have, again, a nonprofit that has 1 or 2 staff members, They're literally doing it all. They're doing fundraising and management and program delivery and all the administrative stuff as well. Next, let's talk about those key factors that go into managing a paid nonprofit staff workforce. Things like hiring, training, and retaining. Hiring in a nonprofit can look a little bit different than hiring in the for-profit sector because if you're leading a nonprofit, you're going to face some distinct human resource challenges. One of those challenges is that we currently are facing workforce shortages in the sector. Again, there are a lot of misconceptions about nonprofit work that lead a lot of folks to not pursue this type of work. Another is a need to ensure a diverse workforce. Nonprofits have really been called to the carpet in recent years, especially nonprofits that aim to serve diversity initiatives when they have a workforce that is very homogenous and that is not diverse. So keeping in mind the need to ensure diversity of workforce is another challenge faced by nonprofit leaders who are doing hiring. Another is the fact that having a small staff makes hiring critical. When you lead a small nonprofit, and remember, small nonprofits on average only have about 5 employees, every single hiring decision you make is critical. And if you hire an underperforming or a toxic employee, it can have a huge effect on the entire team that you wouldn't see so much in a large organization that has hundreds or thousands of employees. And then finally, the big one, resource constraints. It's a little harder to attract and retain staff when they can get higher pay doing similar or sometimes less work in the for-profit sector. Another issue when it comes to hiring and as an outcome of those limited resources is that many nonprofits, unfortunately, fail to properly train new hires. There just simply isn't the time to provide one-on-one training, and there also aren't the resources to outsource training programs. So a lot of times in nonprofit work, especially in the small organizations, if you're hired in a new role, you might be given some operating manuals or some kind of quick guidance, but then you're kind of left then to sink or swim, and you kind of have to figure it out on your own. So working in a nonprofit generally requires that you're a self-starter and that you take initiative to learn things on your own because unfortunately training is a deficiency in a lot of agencies. And when I talk about training, this refers to the process of equipping new hires with all of the necessary skills, knowledge, and info they need to do their jobs and to do it well. For example, if you bring on a new development coordinator, you have to teach them the basics of your CRM or your customer relationship management system. How do they input data? How do they track all of their donor contacts? How do they pull information from a donor database? What's their portfolio of donors? What's the mission of the organization? And how do we sell that mission to donors? So there's a lot of training that goes into this. And unfortunately, a lot of times nonprofits skimp on this. Onboarding is a little bit different than training. Training is giving those essential skills and knowledge, but onboarding is about acclimating into the organization. This involves understanding the culture, the people in the organization, and that can be difficult in nonprofits when you have hundreds of volunteers. So it's not just getting to know your coworkers, but getting to know the board, volunteers, and other constituents as well. And this goes beyond training with just job skills. Now, to give you an actual example of onboarding, this would be to bring a new hire in to a strategic planning session that you're doing with your board and the employees. So that gives them that sense of belonging so they understand and feel like they're really part of the mission. Now, just like a lot of nonprofits kind of skimp out on the training, they also kind of drop the ball when it comes to onboarding. And this is a failure because research shows us that robust onboarding experiences lead to employees who exhibit 50% higher productivity during that initial hiring period. And it also has an impact on retention because employees who receive proper onboarding tend to remain as a part of the organization even after 3 years. So nonprofit leaders should really make an effort to provide adequate training and onboarding opportunities for their new hires, even though they're resource strapped and even though they have no time to spare. Kind of have to make this a priority. Now, let's talk about what happens when we don't do the right things, when we don't onboard and we don't train well. And other factors too can lead to employee turnover. Let's talk about what causes employee turnover and how leaders can identify types of withdrawal behaviors. First, let's talk about retention. Retention is where you're keeping an employee over a period of time. And to do this, it does require strategic actions by leadership. You have to motivate your employees. You have to make sure they're well trained and onboarded. You have to keep them focused and you have to give them the support they need to do their jobs. And while retention is important in any organization, it's arguably more important in nonprofit organizations for a few reasons. One, many nonprofits are categorized as small, 5 or fewer employees. So when you have employee turnover in a really small organization, that has more detrimental effects. Another is the nature of nonprofit work. Nonprofit work is all about cultivating relationships with stakeholders. That can be donors, supporters, corporate sponsors, volunteers, and others. And when you have paid staff that are working closely with these constituents, they're the ones building personal relationships with these key stakeholder groups. So there's a lot of relationship value. There's a lot of knowledge that your staff has about these key stakeholder groups. And that knowledge is not always necessarily properly conveyed or entered into things like CRM systems. So when you have employee turnover in a nonprofit organization and that employee leaves, all of that knowledge, all of that history, and all of those relationships can go with them. One way that we assess retention in organizations is by evaluating employee turnover. Sometimes this is called churn, and this measures the number of employees who leave the organization during a specified period. And generally, this is measured in a 1-year period. Now, if you look at the churn or turnover by sector, you'll find, not surprisingly, that nonprofit agencies generally have higher turnover than the general labor market. Generally speaking, in the entire labor market, the turnover percentage is about 12%, and nonprofits in comparison is 19%. So there's a pretty sizable difference there, which is why retention should be a central focus of nonprofit leadership. It's also important because turnover is expensive. Losing an employee can cost a company up to 2 times the employee's salary because it is expensive and it is labor intensive to replace departing employees, especially if it's a small organization, and especially if that employee has been around for a long time and has a lot of information and relationships with key stakeholders. So trying to replace this and bring someone on board and allowing time for them to build those really important relationships, that costs a lot of money. That also can overburden an already overworked executive director when their staff leaves. Now they have to go through the whole hiring process, usually by themselves because they don't have an HR team to do some of that work. And then they have to manage the onboarding, the training, and then also taking time for that new employee to build those relationships. Those just take time. So why does turnover happen? And why is turnover higher in nonprofits compared to the general workforce? Well, there are a lot of factors. Some of them are, generally speaking, the same things that cause people to quit jobs in any job, not just the nonprofit sector. But in nonprofits, some of these things can be exacerbated because of the nature of the work. One key factor leading to turnover in many nonprofit agencies is burnout. Burnout is when you're just so physically and emotionally exhausted from your job that you can't take it anymore. You might be passionate about the mission. You might even really like your job and like your coworkers, but you are just so overworked and the expectations and the pressure is just too much. But regardless of how much you like the job, you just kind of can't take it anymore. And it starts to make you feel like a failure. You feel like you're not accomplishing anything. You feel like you don't have the support you need to maximize your potential. You sometimes lose your personal identity. Another factor that can lead to turnover in nonprofits is emotional labor. And emotional labor refers to the heaviness of the job and how much that job requires the employee to understand and empathize with other people and internalize their feelings and put on a happy face and not let the emotional burden of the job wear them down. And some nonprofits are just naturally heavier in emotional labor. For example, if you deal with a nonprofit that has a mission to serve pediatric cancer patients, that could be really difficult when you're dealing with sick children who are sometimes dying and you're building relationships with family just to see a child pass away. So that could be a job that's really high in emotional labor, and that can lead to turnover. New hire turnover is a specific measure that looks at the percentage of employees who leave the company usually in an early period within the first year. And new hire turnover can be particularly detrimental because you just went through this process of hiring and onboarding and training, and they just started to build these relationships and do the job. And then you turn around, they quit, and you got to start all over again. So it is particularly devastating, especially to overworked executive directors who have to deal with this. And that's why it's important that we retain our staff. Here are some reasons specifically for new hire turnover. One are misaligned expectations. And I've seen this a lot in the nonprofit sector. Nonprofit work is not always easy. And sometimes executive directors are so eager to make a hire that they kind of sugarcoat the job. They underplay things like the workload. They underplay the hours worked. They promise that you'll work Monday through Friday, 8 or 9 to 5. They promise it's minimal weekends, it's minimal travel. But then the worker gets in the job and then they find out that's not the case. And they're in for a big shock. And that can lead to them wanting to quit pretty early on. because you're not delivering on the promises basically that you made. Another is culture shock, and this is the discomfort that individuals feel when they're confronted with an unfamiliar work practice or values or vibe or dynamic in the organization. This can especially be the case if you're hiring someone from industry that's never worked in a nonprofit. They're usually more prone to culture shock because just the culture of nonprofits in general is something that they have to get accustomed to. And this is why that onboarding part is so important, because the onboarding is about acclimating someone to the job. So making that a more smooth process and a smooth transition can help minimize culture shock. Another thing that can minimize culture shock is assessing culture fit. So when you're making a hire, it's not just looking at the skills and talents of that candidate, but also assessing their values, beliefs, and behaviors, and making sure that that's going to fit within that nonprofit organization. Oftentimes when employees quit, it doesn't just happen overnight or unexpectedly. And managers who are really astute and good leaders can be on the lookout for these withdrawal behaviors. Withdrawal behaviors are actions that an employee exhibits, and it's kind of their way of signaling, hey, I'm kind of not happy at my job. It can be mental or it can be an emotional distancing. Physical withdrawal happens when an employee starts to physically distance themselves from the work environment. This can be things like coming in late repeatedly, leaving early, taking really long lunch breaks, missing work, calling in sick a lot. Psychological withdrawal happens when the employee is pretty much checked out. They engage in their work, but they disengage mentally and emotionally. And this can be signaled by things like goofing off, daydreaming, neglect, or just the observation that they're really not fully in it. Now, what's important for nonprofit leaders, and this is important for retention, it's important for preventing that turnover, is that you're always on the lookout for these withdrawal behaviors. And when you observe them, that you have a willingness to engage in a communication and open dialogue with that employee about these observed behaviors. And you try to rectify whatever it is that's causing that employee to be dissatisfied, so you prevent withdrawal from turning into turnover. Now let's talk about some of the ways that we tend to evaluate performance in nonprofit organizations. But first, I want to get on my soapbox a little bit here and say that sometimes nonprofits get a little overzealous when it comes to evaluating performance. As you've learned, turnover is higher in the nonprofit sector than it is in the general workforce. We also know that hiring is a little more difficult in nonprofits than in the for-profit sector. So when you have employees, you want to retain them. And sometimes when you go a little crazy with performance evaluation, you can drive really good people away. So accountability is important. And leaders need to make sure their employees are doing their jobs. We have to make sure that when we're paying payroll, that the people that we've hired are doing the job and they're delivering on mission. But we need to make sure that we balance that with reasonable expectations, and we have to provide our employees with the resources that they need to do their job well. It's really unfair to bring in an employee, not give them proper training and onboarding, not give them proper resources because of, again, that resource constraint problem that happens in nonprofits, and then give them really high performance expectations. That's setting people up for failure, and it's not only frustrating to that employee and will likely lead to turnover, but it's not beneficial for the organization itself either in the short or long term. So when I talk about holding employees accountable, but doing so realistically, this means that employee goals, sure, they should be difficult, but they have to be achievable. And employees have to be given the adequate resources that they need to achieve them. And we talked previously at length about key performance indicators or KPIs. But there are other ways to measure performance, and this is usually done for employees on an annual basis. This includes MBOs, BARs, and 360-degree appraisals. First, let's talk about MBOs. This is management by objectives. So this is a performance evaluation approach, or a way that we hold employees accountable. That involves setting clear, measurable goals aligned with the mission and objectives of the organization. And like KPIs, MBOs are quantifiable. So we're trying to put a number on things. So for example, for a development position, how much did you raise this year? For a program delivery person, how many constituents did you serve in your program this year? MBOs need to be quantifiable, but they also need to be SMART. And SMART goals are goals that are specific. There's no ambiguity. They're measurable, usually through quantifying things, but you can't quantify everything. They have to be achievable. That's really, really important. They also have to be relevant. It's not fair to give someone a goal and hold them to accountability for something that's really wildly beyond their job scope. And it has to be time bound. So we don't just say, raise $1 billion at some point. No, you have to say, I want you to raise $2.2 million over the next fiscal year, which is a 12-month period. A lot of nonprofits choose to use MBOs because they have a lot of benefits. They provide clear direction, they make sure that individual and team goals are aligned with each other and with the overarching mission, and they also tend to put an emphasis on results. Now, there is one big limitation of MBOs, and that is that it is kind of more geared toward things that can be put on a number or quantified. It's harder for qualitative measures, which a lot of times program and impact delivery, those are harder to quantify. But if you're in a fundraising role, MBOs are great because it's pretty easy to put a number on how many donor meetings are you having, how much money are you raising, and things like that. And in figure 4.3, I give you some examples of how MBOs can be applied to those specific categories of nonprofit work. There's a management position, an administrative position, a development position, and a program delivery position. BARS stands for Behaviorally Anchored Rating Scales. This is another performance evaluation metric, and specifically are measurement tools that assign a numeric value to specific descriptions of employee behaviors. And BARS has a benefit of taking that emphasis away from just strictly numerical assessment, and instead it puts the emphasis on behaviors. And this is helpful for some nonprofits because it encourages behaviors that align with its organizational values and principles that we talked about in the previous lesson. The downside, however, is that BARS can be time-consuming to set up, and assessing these things is more subjective. Numbers don't generally lie. You can more objectively assess performance if you're looking strictly at numbers. When you have a human being assessing behaviors of another human being, that's more subjective and therefore more likely for things like bias and unfair assessment. Some organizations use a BARS scale of 7 to 10 identified behaviors. So they'll identify 7 to 10 behaviors and they'll use the BARS to measure the employee performance on those behaviors. 7 to 10 is kind of a lot, so 5 generally tends to be the most common. Here's an example of a 5-point BARS scale. So you'll see here 5 specific behaviors articulated, and at the end of the year, that employee will be assessed on how they fit within these 5 categories of behaviors. So as you can see, 1 on the low end, this is a volunteer coordinator BARS example. The employee is not responsive to volunteers and their needs. They're not engaging them. They're not responsive to them. That is the behavior we don't want to see. If you're scoring a 1 on this BARS scale, you're probably going to be put on a performance plan or let go. The behaviors we do want to see are the 5. This is the highest level for a volunteer coordinator, where you not only receive incoming volunteer inquiries, but you do a thorough job in vetting that volunteer. You collaborate with them to find the best fit for them within the organization. You onboard and train that volunteer because volunteers need that too, not just paid staff. And then you're also following through, not just plopping them in a position and leaving them to go, but you're periodically checking in with them and actually managing them as a volunteer coordinator to make sure they're doing the things they're supposed to do and also that they're happy and that they're fulfilled. That 5 reflects those positive behaviors, the ideal volunteer coordinator, and is the highest ranking. A 360-degree appraisal is like a circle, 360 degrees, it's full circle. So this is where you're gathering feedback on employee performance from a wide array of individuals with whom that employee works. Now, this approach is great because it is more fair and more holistic because you're getting feedback from a lot of different people. So just because someone might have a beef with their manager and that manager rates them poorly on something like a BARS scale, a 360-degree appraisal gets more input on that employee. The downside, however, is that it's time-consuming and that can even be costly, and time is money. So most nonprofits don't use this approach, or if they do, they unfortunately don't do it well. Regardless of the method that you use, it is important to do regular and quality performance evaluations in order to make sure that you're holding your employees accountable. Now let's talk about how we can apply various theories of motivation to nonprofit employees. Good news for nonprofits, because again, we know we're not paying our people a lot of money, is that the nature of the work, not pay, is the variable most closely correlated with organizational commitment and performance. And what that means is an employee is more driven by their satisfaction with the job and the work itself compared to their pay. So in nonprofit work, our work is inherently motivating and fulfilling because we're helping people. And that can sometimes compensate for that little bit of a pay gap. Motivation can be influenced by either external factors, which are extrinsic rewards. So think of extrinsic as external. These are things like pay bonuses, promotions, a certificate of achievement, a trophy, a pat on the back, things like that. Whereas intrinsic motivation comes from inside, and this is our internal reward for doing work. And a lot of folks feeling called to nonprofit work do generally tend to be intrinsically motivated. So they are by nature going to generally feel more motivated because they feel fulfilled. They feel like they're making a difference. They feel like their hard work is doing something good to make the world a better place. While nonprofit work itself does tend to be naturally intrinsically motivating, that doesn't mean leaders can just throw their hands up and say, I'm good. I don't have to worry about motivating my team. Good leaders focus on things like equity theory, expectancy theory, and goal setting theory, which are three well-known theories of motivation. Equity theory suggests that motivation is driven by that employee's perception of fairness. So if you think about this, we kind of assess our work on a balancing scale. And often we do this subconsciously. We don't even realize that we're doing it. We're assessing all of the inputs that we put into the job, things like our time, our skills, our talents, our efforts. And we're comparing that to the outcomes, the things we get out of the job, our pay, our rewards, our fulfillment, our benefits. And if that scale is in balance and we feel like inputs are equitable to outputs, everything is good. But if that scale gets out of balance and there is a perception of inequity, employees are not going to be happy. They're going to start engaging in withdrawal behaviors, and they're ultimately going to be part of that turnover or churn statistic. To avoid that inequity, leaders have to treat employees fairly. They have to ensure transparency, and they have to make sure that the inputs to output scale is balanced. Expectancy theory says that people are motivated to perform when they have the belief that their efforts will lead to success. That's called expectancy. So if I put in this effort and I work really hard to raise money, I will be successful as a fundraiser. But they also have to believe that their successful performance will lead to desired outcomes. So I have to believe that if I do achieve my fundraising goal, I will move the mission forward, and that money will be spent toward things that support the mission. And there has to be a belief that the outcomes are valuable and aligned with goals. So that term is called valence. So that's a very scientific-y way of saying something that I can more simply state as, basically, your employees have to have confidence in their work. They have to be confident that if they do the work and they put in the effort, they'll be successful, and that performance will translate into outcomes that they value. Promotion opportunities, pay, recognition, things like that. Now, we already know that goals need to be SMART. They need to be specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound. And we know this because of something called goal setting theory. Goal setting theory is an academic theory that actually went out and studied the workforce and determined that when you set specific and challenging goals, but those that are achievable, that can actually increase motivation. So having goals, and even difficult goals, it's not a bad thing. It's a good thing. Now, caveat, remember, in nonprofits, you have to give your employees the tools they need, the resources they need, and you have to make sure that these goals are achievable and realistic. But there's no problem with making goals that are difficult. In fact, they can be a source of motivation. So there you have it. The nonprofit staff, it's an important aspect as a stakeholder group of any nonprofit organization. And unfortunately, working for nonprofits and managing a nonprofit staff is not easy work, but it's an essential element for ensuring success and mission fulfillment for any nonprofit organization.